So first, welcome to Berlin. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to get a pleasure and an honor, I should say, to have a chance here to present with you here today. You've also picked a nice time of year to come, and we've had a pretty gray and cold spring, and finally it feels like the sun is starting to come out and PV output is finally starting to rise again in Germany. So today the focus is going to be on the policy side, and we're going to take a global look at where we are, where we've come from, and what some of the challenges are going forward. If you have any questions as I'm speaking, or if anything isn't clear, then don't hesitate to raise your hand and I can take quick questions, or we can keep them for the end and have a few moments towards the end of the presentation. So first, a quick overview about myself. I work in many of your home countries around the world. I'm currently based here in Berlin, but I'm originally from Canada. And I used to work at the National Renewable Energy Lab in Colorado in the United States. And since then have started E3 Analytics in 2009, and I've been working with governments around the world on policy, strategy, and renewable energy finance since then. So now Berlin is home, and I'm partly what pulled me here and partly what I'm sure inspired you to join the RENAC family is that Berlin really is becoming, in some ways, a hub for the global renewable energy industry. And I think you guys are all, each individually in your own way, one sort of spoke on that hub. And I think it's a pleasure again to have a chance to collaborate with RENAC in this forum. So first, we'll start with the global landscape. We'll look at some of the future questions around the future of renewable energy policy. We'll look at what's happening on rooftops around the world, the potential for significant scale up in rooftop renewable energy and what that means for policy. And then we'll look at the rise of auctions around the world and take a closer look at some of the dynamics that are shaping the landscape in the world of auctions. And then I'll try to close with a couple big picture remarks about where things are going. So the positive news is trends are moving in a very encouraging direction. If you look at forecasts for wind power and solar power installed capacity going back to the 1990s or 2000s, they're all very, very conservative. And consistently, real world development has actually surpassed those forecasts. And we've seen year after year breaking records in new installed capacity, in new levels of investment in jurisdictions around the world. And the big story in recent years is the rise of China in the renewable energy world. You're seeing a growing amount of capacity coming online from Asia, and markets that were previously completely absent or completely weren't focusing or weren't developing any renewable energy are really starting to focus on it more heavily, particularly in the Middle East, parts of Latin America, and even parts of Africa, like South Africa and Morocco. So we're seeing a landscape that's changing fast. Although investments in the European Union are down, the trends globally are actually pushing further and further towards a future where renewable energy is a greater and greater share of the power mix. And a part of this is driven by the cost declines. A big part of this story is that renewable energy is getting cheaper. Cheaper for customers, cheaper for utilities that are buying the power, and also cheaper ultimately for the investors who are investing in it. So it makes it more competitive against other supply options. And that's really starting to have significant impacts on the policy landscape. And we're going to see what that means for the future of renewable energy policy. In the past, renewable energy was always more expensive. So you always had to find a public policy rationale, a climate change rationale, an economic diversification rationale, or some other argument in terms of energy security to justify increasing the share of renewable energy. But now, as we'll see in a few slides, with renewable energy coming down further and further in cost, it's actually becoming, in most markets around the world, the default least cost supply option for new electrical generating capacity. And that's a huge and positive story. But because policy has been, in the past, about bridging the gap between the higher cost of renewables and the lower cost of conventional or fossil generation, when renewables are actually cheaper than conventional generation, what does that mean for policy? Do we even need renewable energy policy? Or can renewables just stand on their own and compete in a quote-unquote open market? So that's sort of the big frame of the debate. There are arguments on both sides. I'll try to walk you through some of that and help you think a little bit more critically about what this means for the industry. So a few snapshots. We've seen just in recent months that the news gets more and more racy as the months go forward, with new auction results pushing ever lower price points on renewable energy installed costs and levelized costs of generation. You can see here, project in Mexico just over a year ago, bidding in at, the winning bids came in at $360 US per kilowatt hour. In Morocco, even cheaper. We saw a bid in Dubai for just under 3 cents a kilowatt hour. Now again, there's some hidden layers behind those headline numbers, and I'm glad to talk a little bit more about that. But the big picture is, in a lot of these markets, renewables are really starting to dominate on cost alone. And they're becoming, as I said, the default option for new electrical supply. Now, there's also questions around integration, questions around how does it interact with existing baseload capacity. As Leon this morning discussed with you, some of those challenges are very real, and trying to find more intelligent ways, more system-friendly ways of integrating all of this new renewable capacity is going to be one of the big challenges in the years ahead. And maybe, as I'll suggest later on, maybe that's partly where policy starts to become relevant again, where it's no longer about bridging the price gap, but rather about finding ways to make renewable energy development smarter, better located, better integrated into the existing electricity system. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So what does this mean? Globally, this gives you a bit of a snapshot of where things stand in terms of the number of countries adopting different instruments. In the past, we've broadly had a handful, 4 or 5 major policy instruments that have driven renewable energy development. There's been the feed-in tariff, there's been auctions or tendering, there's been net metering, which focuses primarily on rooftop systems or self-consumption, and we've had binding targets, or RPSs, along with renewable certificates. In addition to those 4, there's tax incentives, good old-fashioned tax support, either tax rebates, tax taking various shapes, accelerated depreciation, and so on. So this is the landscape. But you can see actually the number of countries is growing, but also here on the bottom, the different color breakdown. So you actually, even though there's been a lot of talk about about the decline of feed-in tariffs around the world, a lot of that decline is actually concentrated in Europe, and many other countries around the world still continue to use feed-in tariffs, and they remain, in fact, the most widely used renewable energy policy instrument. And the logic behind a feed-in tariff isn't necessarily to pay a higher price than the retail price or than the electricity system price. It's just to pay the cost of generation, cost-based compensation, as it was originally established in the German EEG in 2000. Cost-based compensation. So if costs come down, you can continue to pay a cost-based compensation that is below the price of fossil generation, below the price of nuclear generation, or anything else in the system, and still call it a feed-in tariff. So it still can be a policy, even if it's not a subsidy. So it's important to separate the whole policy conversation from the subsidy conversation. In the past, they were one and the same. We used to call whatever was a policy a subsidy, and people who didn't like renewables or who had reasons to be critical of renewable energy, like the incumbent utilities, would use that as an argument to say, well, this is just a subsidy. What we're seeing now is a separation between those two. Policy does not necessarily mean subsidy. Policy can just mean creating framework conditions that allow investors and investments to happen in a low-risk way. That includes things like grid access. That includes things like having a guaranteed off-taker instead of selling into the open market where you don't know what the price is going to be. Even though from some perspective you could still see a guaranteed offtake as a subsidy or a guaranteed purchase agreement as a subsidy, ultimately if a utility is willingly buying that power, then, and it's cost competitive in the market, it's not necessarily a traditional subsidy in the way that we've often thought about it. Renewables are at a point now where that discussion, the old debate around renewable energy subsidies, is really shifting. So, and it's driven, as we've seen, by these cost declines. Now, there's some interesting things happening. I think one point that I always encourage whenever I give presentations around the world on the sort of global landscape and talking about these trends, we almost always focus on the electricity sector. It's important to think outside of the electricity sector box and look at what's happening also in heating and cooling and also what's happening in the transport sector. My honest opinion is we've undergone so much evolution in the electricity sector and have so much focus on electricity sector policy that we've forgotten actually that two-thirds or more of energy consumption, actually more than that in most countries, you're talking more like 90% if you really consider just electricity as a subset of the total energy pie or energy mix, is in these two. The majority of the energy we consume is not in the electricity sector. If you look at the IEA statistics, it's somewhere in the 10% or sub 10% range in most countries. So electricity is actually a pretty small part of the puzzle. It's a much, much bigger challenge to transform the transport sector and to transform the heating and cooling sector. And it's encouraging to see Germany in particular. I've long been, as a Canadian sort of who's moved to Germany and who now has a German wife and a German family, I often look to Germany as the word in German, Vorbild, like as an example to follow for other countries around the world. And I think many other countries do as well. But for a long time, it was there was not enough being done on either of these two sectors. And it's encouraging now to see that debate starting to shift. Germany is starting to think more critically about what needs to be done in the heating and cooling sector and what needs to be done also in the transport sector. Though in the transport sector, it's been dragging its heels, I think. So this lesson, or what comes out of the German discussion, is relevant to every country around the world. It's not enough to just focus on wind power. It's not enough to just focus on building beautiful solar arrays that track, with dual axis trackers all over the place. It's also about how do we transition these other sectors. We haven't really, honestly, in an in-depth way, started having that conversation yet. And I think in terms of the conversations that are going to be, and the challenges and the business models and the innovation that's going to be needed is going to be focused increasingly in these two areas. Hot countries, where air conditioning represents 20 to 30% of electricity load, are going to need serious and innovative solutions to deal with the air conditioning or cooling load. Countries like Canada, where it's minus 40 for half the year, are going to need some very innovative policies and strategies to solve and providing renewable energy forms of heat. Part of that's going to be biomass, but it can't all be biomass. So we're going to need to start thinking about these sectors. And I encourage you as sort of business leaders and people who work in renewable energy around the world to think outside of the electricity sector box and think of the opportunities that are in these two sectors. There's an old quote from Wayne Gretzky, the famous Canadian hockey player, who said, "I don't go where the puck is, I go where the puck is going." And if you look at where the puck is going, it's going here. We're going to need to do a lot more on both of those fronts. So this graph is drawn from a report that we did for the IEA RETD last year. That's the Renewable Energy Technology Deployment sub-arm or collaboration of the IEA. And they asked us to look at the future, essentially, of renewable energy policy. Part of this presentation, in a way, is inspired from some of that work. This graph captures the big three phases. We've had the early commercialization phase, when renewables, we had solar power at $75 a watt in the 1970s. We've come a long way since then. Wind power used to cost north of 80 US cents per kilowatt hour. Now we're down in the 5 to 10 cent range. So we've come a long way. Fossil fuels ranges, this is entirely a simplification. Fossil fuel ranges are more volatile than that. But the broader trend is renewables we're entering what we've called here the policy framework phase, where it's no longer about providing explicit support, but it's rather about providing a framework, an enabling framework that allows investment to take place and that prevents the presence of barriers in the market. Utilities might say, listen, this wind power stuff is nice and fine, but I actually don't want to buy it because I have coal plants that I need to run. So where policy can come in and say, well, actually, those coal plants are more expensive than the wind power and they have all these health effects. So we're actually going to force you to buy renewable through a mandate or through a law, like an RPS or something similar. So you can see that at this stage, even though renewables are cheaper, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a barrier-free transition path to a high penetration renewable energy future. This is not a given. So even though we're in the framework phase, there's still a lot of work to be done. And I'll try to point in some of those directions throughout the presentation. A key characteristic of this framework phase is, as I pointed out earlier, less reliance on subsidies, if any at all. It's no longer about subsidies, it's about providing investment certainty. It's about providing long-term predictability in the market so that it's not start and stop and start and stop every couple years as a new political party comes into power or as various other forces get in the way. So providing long-term investment stability and certainty is more and more important. And it's also, as you've been seeing over the course of the morning, about supporting flexibility and market integration. It's also going to be fundamentally about phasing out excess generation capacity. There are markets, even in Europe, I take Spain for example, that has over 100 gigawatts of installed electrical capacity. Their peak demand is just under 40. And in the depths of the financial crisis, sort of in the 2009 to 2012 period, electricity demand was going down by several percent per year. They were left with a peak of somewhere just north of 30 gigawatts with installed capacity of like 105 gigawatts. So you have massive overcapacity in the electricity system, way more than is needed to meet end user load. So and one of the reasons why Spain had to kind of slow down and stop beyond the whole subsidy and cost issue, the deficit within the electricity system that they're still trying to drag themselves out of, the fundamental reality is Spain is in a position of massive excess capacity. How do you bring on 10 more gigawatts of renewable capacity when you already have you already have essentially 40 to 50 gigawatts of capacity that are barely being used? The connections with France, you could, in a perfect world, the connections with France, they've just added a new line, but the export capacity is very limited. We're talking a few gigawatts, and France is not a willing buyer because France has baseload nuclear. So France says, well, thank you very much for all this beautiful wind power, but we'll pass. So it's a real challenge. And Spain, although Spain is not an island, it's a peninsula, it's connected to the European continent, because of those physical limitations in the system, interconnection capacity, the level of market integration, they're not able to make full use of their renewable energy potential. And then there's politics. There's always politics. It's like the old joke about death and taxes. Politics get in the way. If we have excess capacity, how do you phase out the excess coal? How do you phase out the excess nuclear? in the system. These are deeply, intrinsically political questions. But if we're going to get to a high renewable energy share, again, I'm focusing on the electricity sector, if we're going to get to a high share of renewables, we're going to need to address the excess capacity question. We're going to need to start phasing out. There are some positive examples. So Germany has, as everyone no doubt knows, has announced the exit from nuclear energy. In Canada, the province of Ontario fully phased out and shut down its coal plants, several gigawatts of coal. So now Ontario, the entire province, is coal-free. It was largely driven by health arguments, but they also had excess capacity, and they said, okay, we're just going to do it. Political decision, very tough. And it's been hard, all the transition and the job creation and the sort of economic dislocation. It's not easy. But again, if we're going to get to high shares of renewables, we need to get serious about phasing out excess generation capacity. Another challenge, and I'm going to push this a step further, is that what happens in a market that's based on supply and demand? When you have too much supply, prices crash. One of the consequences of having spot markets are great. They help allocate the supply and demand from producers to consumers. There's probably never been a more efficient mechanism in terms of economic efficiency at allocating supply and demand than an electricity spot market, a well-designed, well-functioning electricity spot market. But when you have excess capacity in the system and you have a very sunny day or a very windy day, you're left with huge overcapacity, huge oversupply, which leads to prices collapsing. So if the wind and solar producers are reliant on those market revenues, as they are in jurisdictions like Texas, if they're selling their electricity on a competitive spot market, they suffer from a form of self-cannibalization. They're all producing at the same time, inject all the power into the network, everyone's happy, we have higher shares of renewables, and yet prices go way down, and in some cases even negative. We've seen negative prices of almost €1,000 per megawatt hour in the European electricity market. And now in Texas, I think the cap goes down to $5,000 on the minimum. You can go so we're talking very, very permissive regulation to try to allow negative prices to correct this excess supply into the system. Yeah, quick, sure. Yeah.
So are you seeing a shift in policy and therefore in certain countries maybe more advanced towards subsidies around storage and thereby allowing transportation of excess capacity?
So that would be, the storage option would be one pathway forward. You could say, well, listen, we have very windy days, very sunny days. Even in Germany, wind and sun produce, on the best days, produce over 80, and I think on some days even now over 90% of total electricity, instantaneous electricity demand.
We had days when we covered completely already.
But just for hours of the day. Yeah, exactly. So it's just, when you break it down, there are periods when the supply is very significant. So one idea would be, when you have those peaks of supply, yeah, you build storage. But then the question is, well, again, my inner economist comes out and I start thinking, well, is that the most cost-effective way to solve this particular problem? And it actually may not be. And when you run the analysis, as some of my ex-colleagues at NREL have done, you actually find that storage is one of the most expensive ways of dealing with that excess capacity. Partly because storage has incurs significant losses, like traditional electricity storage, and because there are just other ways of doing exactly what storage does that are cheaper. So one way is to shift load, shift electricity demand, either by turning it on or by turning it off. So for example, there's a lot of interest now in dispatching thermal loads, so that when there's an excess of capacity, instead of trying to find a beautiful battery bank that you can, and investing in it, that can be financially profitable based on current market dynamics in a competitive electricity market, which is very, very difficult for storage, it may actually be easier to get smart about turning on and turning off demand. Electricity systems function in a way kind of like a maestro in an orchestra. It's fundamentally dispatching the violins, the cellos, bringing the trumpet on board, bringing a little louder over here, a little less loud over here. That's what the conductor does. That's what the maestro does. And an electricity system operates in many ways on a similar principle. You have an independent system operator that dispatches and coordinates the different generators. One view or one option in the future is that we have much more of that coordination happening, but we're not just dispatching power plants. We're also dispatching load, turning on demand. And you could have aggregators or companies whose job it is to actually be smart about turning on load. The great thing about turning on load is that it's instantaneous. You don't have to wait for, like a gas plant is our next best option. But even a gas plant, even the most efficient, take 10 to 12 minutes to really get ramping. There are a few that can get a bit shorter, but you're talking, there's a bit of a delay. With demand, you can flick it on and it's there. So for system integration, I think the future of dispatching loads, of turning on large amounts of supply, could be coordinating electric vehicle charging. It could be coordinating things like thermal storage. So instead of traditional electric storage, what about thermal storage? What about turning on cold water or hot water units? It doesn't have to be water, it could be a glycol, it could be some sort of, a lot of innovation is going, this comes back to my point about the heating and cooling components of the picture above. And the sector, the transport sector. We're going to need more of what the Germans called is sector coupling, connecting the electricity sector with the transport sector and connecting both with the heating and cooling sector. And part of that is going to be, again, to help deal with those moments of excess capacity. In the future, we're probably going to be in a position of perpetual electricity generation surplus. And the question is going to be, how do we coordinate that surplus? It can't be like agricultural markets. Agricultural markets, when you produce a bunch of apples or you grow a whole bunch of potatoes, you have an excess of that commodity. Electricity is much, much different, and we're going to need different mechanisms than the traditional sort of hedging and futures markets. We're developing similar sort of analogous products in the electricity sector, but I think, again, there's more innovation needed. We need to think a little bit more carefully about what the electricity sector needs to meet its future needs, and also what it needs to remain financeable. At the core of this transition, as we transition to a largely renewable energy future, it's about making sure that it remains investable, that it remains bankable, that we can still continue to ensure a scale-up in this infrastructure investment. Fundamentally, renewable energy is about infrastructure investment, whether it's in the transport sector, the heating and cooling sector, or in the electricity sector. So how do we, part of what we, to come back to our discussion around the policy framework, part of what we lay out in this paper is that those are the kinds of things that we're going to need more of in this framework phase. And as I point out here, just being cheaper is not enough. You still read what I call sort of the naive economist argument, that yeah, if renewables are cheaper, that's fine. We don't need any policy. Regulators and policymakers can just go home because the job is done. Now, on the one hand, that's great. If the job is done, then we can celebrate and renewable energy will take over the world. Having worked with governments around the world, you realize that it's not that simple. And there continue to be very real barriers to the uptake, even if it's cheaper. So, one of the key points is that now that renewable energy sources are cost competitive, what kinds of framework conditions are still needed to drive continued investments in technologies like solar and wind? Are there new and alternative ways that we can deploy them once they become competitive? focusing on three key components. We tried to think about what the basic building blocks would be. And we came up with these three: flexibility, bankability, and vision. So aspects that connect to the longer-term vision necessary to provide that long-term investment certainty. So some of them are flexibility, about integration and smarter dispatching. Some of them are about producing or providing investment certainty or investability. And the third are just about providing that long-term strategic certainty about the direction of the sector, which is exactly what some governments have basically stopped doing. If you look at the US, if you look at, I mean, even Canada by some measures, although we have a new government, and in many parts of Europe, that long-term certainty, that long-term vision is no longer there, beyond the sort of 2020 targets. So, as we move forward, we're going to get into this dynamic more and more. And in many of the countries where you live or where you originally come from, you've no doubt seen this trend underway. As the share of wind and solar, again, I've been focusing mostly on wind and solar because in the long run, most of the new supply will probably be wind and solar. Because biomass is limited, geothermal is not universally available. The most widely available, universally available, basically, renewable energy technologies are wind and solar. So in most countries, it's going to be, other than the places that have a lot of hydro, like Brazil and certain parts of Africa and countries or jurisdictions like Quebec in Canada and parts of Russia, where hydro is abundant. Leaving those out, it's going to be mostly about wind and solar. I think Agora and Energiewende, that published a big report on their 12 theses for the Energiewende, is correct on that point, that it's going to be mostly wind and solar. So this gives you a sense of what those challenges bring. When you have a large amount of wind and solar, you get into overcapacity, oversupply. Denmark, on some days, produces more wind than it consumes over the entire day. It's a net exporter during the windiest days. That's great for Denmark, but in the long run, we're going to need, again, larger electricity system areas and larger balancing areas to be able to bring that extra supply from Denmark down to Austria or to Spain if it's not as windy in Spain. And those are some of the challenges. And those are, again, some of the investments that are going to need to remain bankable in order for us to move forward. So I encourage you to think beyond the traditional renewable energy box, beyond the traditional renewable electricity box, in thinking about what does the entire electricity system, what does the entire energy system need to look like for us to get where we need to go. And it's not just about wind turbines and solar panels. There's a lot of infrastructure in the system that needs to happen, that needs to be built. And in some ways, that's where the more innovative and interesting business models are going to emerge. Having EPC contracts to build solar projects is fine. Building solar has gotten a lot more interesting. But the amount of innovation there is probably, I don't want to be too firm on this, but the innovation is, most of the innovation is going to happen elsewhere. And that's where we're going to need bright minds and people focusing on these challenges. So, coming to the point about integration, as you have these rising shares, you had mentioned storage, which is a great question. I think is where most people, it's what most people think of first. But as this graph shows, the relative economics actually put some of the storage options at the higher end of the spectrum, whether chemical, pumped hydro, thermal, or fuel storage.
Even battery storage, so transportable batteries. I was thinking that rather than lakes.
Yeah, you mean like electric vehicles or? Yeah. Yeah, I think, so currently chemical forms of storage are at the higher end, in fact, of the spectrum because batteries are still quite expensive. Now, batteries are also coming down very rapidly in cost. If batteries get to, $20 a kilowatt hour, then we're in a different world. In fact, I think the electricity sector is going to benefit a lot from the rise of electric vehicles. because the same massive rollout that Germany and a few other countries did with solar power to bring the cost down globally is going to happen in the storage sector, driven by the rise of electric vehicles. As we get to 10 million cars, 20 million, 50 million, 150 million cars on the road, the economies of scale in the battery industry are going to bring costs down, and already are. So I think this will definitely come down and will become more cost competitive. But, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, so this is what they have here. This is, again, these are just a sort of benchmark, but this is based on deeper analysis done at NREL on the relative costs of different storage options. So even thermal, according to their analysis, is still high on the relative spectrum. Yeah, and I think those are where, as the costs come down in those areas, they will become more and more attractive. But part of the problem with the thermal is you have losses, the inefficiencies, and then it's not as easy to do it over large areas to distribute it, so you end up with lots of small investments. So there's a few pilot projects. For example, I was in an island recently, they were doing a wind to hot water system, basically to allow the hot water heater to take, so distributed in thousands of households, to take up that excess wind power whenever the wind was blowing too much. So, you know, things like that are definitely possible. And for some areas will be actually the best options. But anyway, this gives you a spectrum. I don't want to focus too much on this. You can find, but it gives you a sense of the universe of possible options. So, moving forward. Let's talk about the rooftop revolution. How are we doing for time? Okay, so yeah, So let's talk the rooftop revolution. There's a rapid rise of distributed solar happening around the world. Some of it driven by net metering, some of it just driven by the economics of self-consumption. In many places, like in Germany, we pay about 30 euro cents a kilowatt hour. It's about 40 or just shy of 40 US cents per kilowatt hour when you include all the grid costs and so on. At that price, if I can develop residential PV on my roof for, say, 11 euro cents per kilowatt hour, maybe 10, why am I paying an electricity bill? A growing number of households are starting to do that. Now, if you want to fully replace your supply, you need storage, and that gets more expensive, and it's not just about the levelized cost. You need to also think about your security of supply needs, whether it really is meeting all of your supply. So there are deeper issues here, but it is cost effective to produce solar on your rooftop today, and in many places in the world, and almost over half of the states in the United States, it's cheaper currently, depending on which market you're in, than your retail price. Hence, the potential for a rooftop, I put a question mark there, rooftop revolution. Hence the potential for a rapid scale up of rooftop solar around the world. But a lot of this was driven and continues to be driven by policy that enables rooftop solar to sell or export its excess to the grid. In most cases, that's been driven by net metering. But net metering, in most cases, is just a compensation. It's not a payment. It's basically a As I point out here, the story is not always a friendly one, and there is a lot of friction, a lot of tension between but the utilities that have take-or-pay contracts are, unless they really want to break the law or go into retroactive changes, are forced to buy those for the duration of the contract. That's a decision they made. And so as cheaper power supply comes online, they need to find ways of integrating that. Many utilities are hesitant to sign long-term contracts now because renewables keep coming down. So why would I sign a long-term contract with something when prices are collapsing and continue to go down? So the optionality, buying a long-term contract just reduces your optionality. You want to minimize that risk and keep your options open. So utilities or buyers typically want to lock in less long-term contracts when renewable prices are declining. But what investors need and what households need who are developing, they need some degree of predictability. And that's where, again, there's a role for policy to come in and create the framework conditions that allow you to reconcile those two different priorities, or those two different issues. Yeah.
Just a question about the distributed generation facilities will rely on the grid just mainly to the third generation that we can just to synchronize maybe with the grids and in this case maybe to supply the supplementary some marginal loads you have if you don't have enough storage.
Mm-hmm.
So from the perspective of the utilities, so you have the combined cycle power plant,
Mm-hmm.
you need it to operate for, let's say, minimum maybe 7,000 hours at maybe more than 60 or 70% full capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Then what is how does the policy takes into consideration the generation part of the equation?
The conventional generation piece. Yeah.
So because their investment needs to
Yeah.
be feasible as well.
Yeah.
Because no generation IPP will be interested to invest if he will supply only for 1,000 hours per year or
Yeah.
at maybe 20 or 30%
Yeah.
capacity factors.
Yeah. And that's a great question, and it gets to the heart of some of these challenges. It comes down to whose future revenue do you protect? Do you protect the future revenue of the fossil plant, of the coal plant, or the generator that you've guaranteed 5,000 full load hours? Or do you protect the output of the wind and solar guys who can't really control when they produce as easily as the fossil guys? So there's and either of those choices is a policy choice. Doesn't happen in a vacuum. Both of those have implications. And I think what we've seen in the past is that renewables have gotten the guaranteed offtake. In most cases, they've gotten priority dispatch because of the fact that they're high fixed cost investments. You don't really have much O&M. So most of the costs are locked in up front. In order to make those investments bankable, you need to provide that long-term stability. Whereas with fossil plants, particularly a gas plant, guaranteeing a minimum full load hours for a gas plant, I think is just bonkers in the future. That does not make sense anymore. It's the wrong policy approach because gas should be your most flexible supply source. Why lock it in for a minimum as a base load generation? This is what we're seeing actually in many US states because of all the cheap gas coming on the system from all the shale activity. Utilities are dispatching gas over coal. So coal, the decline of coal in the US is driven partly by just raw economics, not so much by climate considerations, because the gas is cheaper than the coal. But again, is the best use of gas baseload generation? Probably not. So when it comes down to who to protect or whose revenues to protect, it's probably better to keep the gas as an ancillary, as a service provider in a way, as a flexible source of generation, rather than locking them into a guaranteed full load hours agreement. And I think that's where that, again, is a policy choice. And that's partly what we mean when we talk about the broader framework conditions to enable renewable energy. Because if you lock in too much conventional generation, you also lock out the potential for significant continued renewable energy investment. So you need to make, that's partly why your question really nicely illustrates some of those trade-offs.
So also this includes the infrastructure, the transmission lines, also you need to, these investments to be feasible. So who will do these investments?
They need to be bankable. That's our most important pillar. Bankability, flexibility, and a long-term vision. Those investments, whether they're supply-oriented investments, whether they're load management or load dispatching-oriented investments, whether they're transmission and distribution or substations related, they need to be bankable too. And that's the challenge. In some ways, it's like what Amory Lovins calls an n-dimensional chess problem. You know, we have multiple different dimensions of this issue that you need to manage and to balance. And in the past, it was a lot easier when you just had, you know, a couple dozen generation assets of which you knew the lifespan, of which you knew the characteristics. Now we're talking with the rooftop revolution potentially of millions of, in Germany now there's 1.4, give or take, million PV units, individual rooftop systems. Managing the electricity system and making sure that the grid still has enough, that there's enough investments left to cover transmission and so forth is increasingly critical. With transmission, we typically have a different framework. We continue to pay them on a kind of a cost-plus basis. Transmission, I think it will be fine, as long as you can get around the public support issue, or the public opposition issue, I should say. But your point, I think, is absolutely correct. It's not just about thinking around the bankability of the renewable energy investments, it's also making sure that all of those other ancillary investments in distribution, transmission, and so on can also be profitable. And again, at some stage, you need policy to govern that, because they aren't going to happen without some framework conditions. So you can see here that this rooftop revolution is not going to happen easily. In almost every state in the US, there's opposition and there's legal. Is based on, and much of the investments in the system are based on. So we have a fascinating story unfolding here, and there's a potential for many interesting chapters to come, because I really do think we're just at the beginning. Although the genie's out of the bottle, he hasn't even gotten started yet. So a few final words on auctions before we wrap up. This shows a snapshot, essentially, of where auctions are taking place around the world. But in most countries, in most cases, it's not just one policy, you've got a whole basket of policies. So it's not as simple as just like Bloomberg New Energy Finance likes to say, you know, that auctions are taking over the world. That's too simplistic. Most countries still have more than one policy. And actually, auctions are coming under pressure. On the one hand, yes, competitive tendering can bring lower prices and have been a very important part of doing that, making possible a lot of what we were just talking about. But there's also concerns in places like Germany, but also in different parts of the world, in Africa and in parts of Asia, around the ability of people, of smaller customers, of smaller players to compete. There was an auction recently in Turkey. I was just working with the Turkish government on their auction regime, and their first round, it's astounding. They allocated something like 600 megawatts as the first auction round. The entire thing, 600 megawatts, went to one consortium. Long-lived competition, yes, but what is that doing to the ecosystem? I mean, the ecosystem of other industries and suppliers and small businesses that could have had a part of that market that are now shut out because that one consortium, one, is going to build a big PV farm and is going to essentially own the market. So the oligopolistic tendencies of the electricity industry that some people thought were a thing of the past, with the rise of renewables, because renewables are typically smaller, modular, more distributed by their nature, watch out, because we're actually in a lot of jurisdictions seeing precisely that, those same tendencies coming back. And Turkey, I just cite one example, but if you look at the auction breakdowns in many other countries, you see similar dynamics. Larger and larger blocks of capacity going to fewer and fewer players. And some of you may work for, I mean, again, there's some good, this is not a commentary about the companies winning these bids. It's about the market architecture. It's about the ecosystem of industries and players and the jobs that are enabled through that and what the structure of the industry looks like in 10 years or in 20 years. And one concern when you tender everything out through a large-scale auctions and you pick the cheapest bid is that you potentially squeeze out a lot of the smaller players. Fortunately, that argument is starting to gain weight in Germany. Hasn't yet seemed to really carry much weight in Brussels. So we will see where this conversation goes. But again, it's important, if there's one thing that I hope you can sort of take from as a theme through this short presentation is always try to think of it from a broader perspective. Take a step back and look at the whole. Look at the long-term evolution. Look at where these short-term changes lead to in the long run. And I think there's still a lot of changes ahead. So we're going to need a diverse ecosystem. Ecosystem of technologies. It can't all be solar. Nor can it all be any technology, whether it's storage or dispatch. There needs to be an ecosystem. There needs to be an ecosystem of players. And that's fundamentally, if there's another lesson to take from Germany, that's actually something, again, during the boom years that Germany did quite well. There were opportunities at multiple different levels, at all levels, from the residential scale all the way to the utility scale, to the offshore wind farms. And that, if you want a full and flourishing renewable energy market, the only way to secure that is to have activity happening at all those levels. And I think that's partly why this ecosystem picture is going to be critical. It can't all be about the big guys. It can't all be about the 500 megawatt CSP plants in North Africa, although we need those too. Yeah.
I know what an option is, but what is an option in the renewable energy sector?
So typically, it's sometimes also called tendering, but the idea is you set out an amount of capacity that you want, let's say 200 megawatts or 400 megawatts, and you allow people to bid for that capacity.
The government says 400.
Yeah, exactly. Or the regulator, or the utility in some cases. The utility can say, I want this much, and then people bid on it, and typically you choose the best bid in terms of price and technical quality. So that's the idea. So this is basically it, and then we can just take a few questions. Yeah, thank you. Sorry for going. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Go ahead here on the right. Go ahead. Yeah.
So let's say now we don't need much of a subsidy, let's say for solar. Don't you think some technologies in the solar itself, like the building integrated photovoltaic, will still require some support? Because it's still not where the other standard PV is.
Yeah, there was a debate early on in Germany about whether there should even be a different feed-in tariff for thin film and sort of crystalline PV, and then there was a debate around whether there should be. So I think whether building integrated is a separate product class that needs particular policy support is a decision governments need to make. If there are significantly convincing arguments in favor of rooftop integrated, so building integrated, that's a very unique market niche, then yes, there may be a case for support, but it needs to make sense, and it needs to provide sufficient additional value that justifies the additional cost in a way. So France is probably the most widely known market. They had a very specific regulations for building integrated, that it had to be, there's this great word in French, that it had to protect the étanchéité of the roof, which is like some crazy word that means the air and water tightness. You have to protect the air and water tightness of the building structure. And the PV had to replace that air and water tightness, quality that the previous roof did. And then you needed that so I don't know, is it worth paying significantly more for solar PV that can provide air and water tightness in a roof rather than just laying it on top? I'm not sure. I think Tesla and the new tiles will probably make true building integrated and will make it remain a niche. But again, that's just my honest opinion. I think making it a tile is fine. If you can do it cheaper, why do we, again, there may be arguments I haven't heard, but why do we need to have it fully integrated into the building structure? Why can't it just be like tiles on top? So I don't know. I leave that open, but that would be the kind of question that fundamentally comes down to policy. Yeah. You were first, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we understand this option revolution is going on in the solar industry. I know it's a mad rush after 3 cents or 2 cents. I don't know, maybe it's 3 also. Somebody may move 3 also in the next couple of years. But the point is, it all depends on location specific. The individual or company, cost of capital, all is in place.
Mm-hmm.
So the question I would like to ask, in your view, you've seen a couple of actions, architects, some of the things. What are the key underlying areas to be looked on these auctions, and what could be the hidden agenda in this type of deals has been gathered or deals has been captured? What are the key areas to be looked on?
Mm-hmm.
But generally people take that as a benchmark. If one area is 3 cents, they want to do it at 3 cents in other areas.
Mm-hmm.
So what is your view on that?
We're working on a paper right now with Agora and Agivenda on exactly that question. So how can we make that 3 cent per kilowatt hour renewable generation available everywhere? So how do you take the key components of successful auctions or of successful policies and scale them elsewhere? So a couple quick few points. Making sure the off-taker is bankable and reliable is key. There needs to be security on that. Making sure that currency and inflation risks are captured within the PPA. You can't have If there's uncertainty over that, you push up the cost of capital, which pushes up the levelized price at the end. Land, some of the cheapest bids that have been won have actually been with pre-packaged land, so pre-packaged sites selected by the government where development can take place. Now that's easy if you're Abu Dhabi and you're surrounded by desert. It's not so easy if you're Bangladesh and you're surrounded by people and very limited agricultural land. So those are a few quick ones. Grid interconnection, having streamlined processes to make sure that everything can be quick and well, and efficiently run. And I still think that price is only part of the picture. So I always encourage policymakers to take a bit more of one of the things I love about Germany is there is this quality, this intrinsic appreciation for quality. People are prepared to pay a little bit more, in some cases significantly more, for a proper car instead of buying the cheapest car on the market. I mean, who goes in and, so there's an open question without going too far down that path in the electricity sector whether price should be, I guess the question maybe to take a step back is how important is price in relation to other bid characteristics in the total weighting of the evaluation. And some countries now where price used to be like 70%, in some jurisdictions they're actually making price as a weighting only 20 to 30%, where technical track record and other components, local job creation, actually are more important and can get a separate weighting within the evaluation. So those are a few quick points, but I'd love to follow up, and if there's to answer that a bit more in detail, and happy to send along a report or two to help you think that through. Yeah.
Quick question.
Yeah.
How do you actually support or try to convince the policymaker to go in the right direction and to set out a long-term vision, toward the future and less toward the past?
It helps to not be a 74-year-old real estate developer who happens to, no, I think, how do you get a long-term vision? At the end of the day, the most important challenges that we face are long-term in nature. People freaked out around, the migrant crisis and the, short-term climate impacts, hurricanes, terrorism. Those are, yes, they have long-term dimensions, but when you really take a step back, how do you get people to think and prioritize the long term? Yes, partly it's about leaving a world for our children and grandchildren. I think that argument cuts regardless of what culture, nation, jurisdiction you're from. That's a universal. So that would be I think if we're going to inspire a new generation of leaders to really take climate change seriously, to take renewable energy, the transition seriously, then it really has to be about the future we're leaving for our children and grandchildren. I mean, there's nothing more important. So that would be my quick answer to that. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Sure, yeah, I'm sensing that the lunch is scheduled, so I don't want to, but thank you so much for your questions, and I'd be happy to follow up by email after. I left my details. I actually forgot my business cards, but you have my information there. So thank you very much again.
Thank you so much.